We're going to talk about interviewing today because one of the things that I've sort of come to learn really over the last, 20 years or so since I've really been working as a professional writer, especially writing, I guess, for lack of a better term, long-form journalism, creative nonfiction, narrative, whatever you want to call it, whatever term you want. But one of the things that we really don't get enough training in, and I went to journalism school, is interviewing. We get a lot of training as journalism students in newspapers, in learning how to do interviews, which is you're gruff, you go in, you ask 5 questions, you get what you want, you get out. Well, that's not really the interview that's going to get you what you want if you're doing a 5,000 word story, or if you're doing something that's a little more narrative, or if you're doing something that's a lot more nuanced. And so it's something that I have typically seen over the years that we don't get a lot of training in, and especially in the last 15 years since I started 18 Bridges with Lynn Cody and I started it. And then also I teach at the Banff Centre for the Arts. I've been there for about maybe 15 years on faculty, is a lot of people don't get really direct training on some of these skills. So I have kind of developed this talk, but it is a talk that I've had many times with dozens and dozens of writers who I've worked with as an editor, either at the Banff Centre or at the University of Alberta or on 18 Bridges on how to do interviewing. Because gathering some of the information, the key information, we're going to need to write a good story, a story that clearly and effectively shares with the reader the information we want them to receive, and a story that's told in as informative and pleasing a mode as your outlet will allow. It depends on who you write for. You write for something like Western Living, you get some scope, you get some space, it can be a lot of fun. But a huge part of doing all that is solid and thorough and thoughtful research. And again, this is something that for those of you who do this kind of work, for those of you who want to do this kind of work, if you're going to want to write long form stories, somebody said to me once, what percentage of a story is the research before you sit down to write? And I would say for me, probably we're looking at least 75% of the work is the research that you do in advance. And the more research you do, the higher quality the research. Trust me, the easier the story is going to be to write. Research really is the reporting, the going out, gathering of all the materials you're going to need to fulfill your mandate, your assignment, your goal, which is to write a story that will entertain and enlighten your reader. You're going to use as many skills as you have. And so reporting really is going out, gathering the material, doing the research. So now I know people that I talk to who operate in that sphere, and myself, I always frame it that way. I'm going out, I'll do the reporting. And a huge part of the reporting is interviewing. Because research, of course, interviewing is part of all that, but research really is integral to a great story. And interviews are often integral to great research. So what compromises the research phase of writing a story? Well, research has a philosophical component to it. And I don't mean that you necessarily are doing philosophical research. What I mean is the research has an element to it that says something about who you are. And this is something we're going to focus on a little bit today, because being a great interviewer really also means understanding who you are as a person and as a writer, as an interviewer. So it has a philosophical component. It says something about who you are. It's an expression of your professionalism. That's something I'm also going to allude to at various points today. Being a great writer means you're a great researcher. It means you're a great interviewer. It means you're very professional. And we'll talk about what that means as we move along. It's the professionalism you're sharing with your peers, with your audience, and indeed with your craft. You're paying honor to your craft if you're being very professional. And in the end, it's about due diligence. Ultimately, research is gathering information. We're going to talk about the different types of information that you're going to need to gather. It's about providing context for your reader. It's about sourcing reliable information. Very, very important. There's a lot of information available out there nowadays. And Really, one thing that's always important to remember, we're going to talk about this a little bit further on when we talk about the relationship between you and the person you're interviewing. We must never forget that we are a surrogate for the reader. And so we need to be finding the best information on behalf of the reader. We need to be asking questions on behalf of the reader. So really, research is turning opinion into reporting. It's the gathering of concrete data, reliable data, that makes it reporting, not opinion. And reporting can involve primary and secondary research, looking through text, observing, or our focus today, talking to people. So ultimately, what are you after? You're looking to find material that is going to allow you to turn something from opinion into reporting, from guesswork into informed narrative. Quite often, this involves as much physical sensory data as you can find. I can never stress this enough. This is so important when I teach writing, when I edit, when I'm sending people out on assignment, when I myself go out on assignment. I am constantly looking for concrete physical sensory data about everything. Not just the world around me, not just the chairs and the room and the air, about the person I'm interviewing, the shirt, the pants, the shoes, the shape of the body, the hair, the smell, everything. You're looking for as much data as possible. This kind of information may not always make it directly into the piece, but it really informs and flavors your piece. It's this kind of complete physical sensory data collection is kind of the bay leaf of a story. You don't eat the bay leaf, but you'll miss it if it's not in the stew, right? So you really want to have that in there. And when you accumulate a wealth of physical data, then when you sit down to write, then you'll have options. So you're gathering this data as you go. Again, I'm going to allude to this a little bit later on when we talk about note-taking versus recording. Even when I'm recording, and I don't always record. I record probably 80% of the time. But even when I'm recording, I take copious notes, because those notes are always places where you are recording, not just what the person is saying, but you're recording all the information around them. You're recording the tone of voice when they said something surprising. You're recording how the person, their face flushed when they told something that you thought might have been a little bit of an untruth. You're recording all this information. You can't use it all, but when it comes to physical description, it's always better to have options, and then you can choose the one or two really salient details instead of a dozen. But you want to be able to have that choice available to you. So really, we're trying to gather as much physical sensory data. Then we also want written data, secondary data. This is going to provide us with insight, with information. These are the kinds of things where you are doing all, your internet searches, you're doing your secondary, you're going to libraries, you're reading, and this also plays into that. And then the gathering of as much emotional input as you can find. Again, mostly so that it informs how you structure and present a lot of the other information. Some people call this hunches, some people call it intuition, some call it just experience. But pay attention to what you're feeling when you're going through an interview. This is very, very important. You're going to go into an interview. I certainly go into interviews with a list of questions, but you can always tell a great interviewer from a really bad interviewer, say if you're listening to the radio or TV or something like that, when somebody says something really fascinating, but then the next question is on a completely different subject. That is somebody who is not a skilled interviewer. You have to play your hunches. If somebody is saying, you ask somebody, well, where were you on the night of the 13th? Were you at this restaurant where the shooting happened? And the person says, well, I wasn't there. Well, the transcript of that is, I wasn't there. But what you heard was an ellipsis, then an ellipsis, then an ellipsis. So your hunch is, okay, there's something this person isn't telling me. And you say, well, were you there or weren't you? Were you there at a different time? So you play that out. This is emotional input. You have to really learn to trust your gut when you're doing interviews. So you want emotional data. So pay attention to that. Okay. And it can also be good. These things are not necessarily about, trapping people or about negative things. I mean, you can be at a conference. This has certainly happened to me before when I've gone out to report on a certain story, and then in the doing of that story, you meet somebody, or you hear somebody talk, or you see something and you think, that is mind-boggling. I have to talk to that person. That's incredible. So then you talk to that person, and that turns into an even better story than the one you were doing to begin with. So always pay attention to your hunches and write them down. That's the other thing. Always take notes, always write them down, because if you're anything like me, if you're vaping your CBD, then you'll forget. So always take notes. And then, of course, on top of all this research, then you're also looking for on-the-record statements, interviews, stories, anecdotes, conversations, reminiscences, anything gleaned from the insight of a source relevant to your inquiry. And that's everything. On-the-record statements, interviews. So these are the things that quite often are what you get when you get an assignment. I'm trying to remember a piece I did recently. So I did a piece recently for the Walrus about Michael Ignatieff in Budapest. So I went to Budapest, had my 1 hour with Ignatieff, but there were little side stories, and then there were other people that I sort of ran into, and then so there's always these little things that end up being outside the scope of what you're actually allotted to get, and then it becomes stories, anecdotes, conversations, reminiscences. So anything gleaned from a source, that can be an interview. It's not just, I was there for an hour, but then, on my way out, Ignatieff walked me to the elevator, and he said, by the way, I tell you, this Orban guy, this prime minister, he's just a nutcase. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this guy. That's part of your interview. You are always on the record. Everything that happens between you and anybody that has anything to do with your story is an interview, and it's on the record. Unless they explicitly say it's off the record.
Before or after?
What's that?
Do they need to say it before or after to be given that opportunity to keep it off the record?
It's better if it's before. But for sure, you don't want to be unethical about it. If somebody says, by the way, I can't have said that. I can't be quoted as saying that. Like, my career is going to go down the tubes. I should have said it was off the record. Please don't quote me. I would never quote somebody like that. Yeah. You obviously have to have an ethical radar about it. Good question though. So this is all the research component. So doing strong research, it's building the foundation of your house. You have to have concrete, rebar, beams, structurally sound, a great map, a drawing. You have to have all that. Then when you're doing the interior decorating, that's the writing of the story. Because all that is just going to flow out of having a strong foundation. If you take shortcuts, the story will be structurally weak. If you don't do enough research, if you don't interview enough people, if you don't ask them the right questions, if you don't get enough time with them. So you have to have an abundance of data. And then at that point, you're going to have a strong story. So research is a huge undertaking. There's no way around that. Multiple interviews, sifting, thinking. Again, I was saying probably 75, 80% of my work on a story is the research. There are always going to be clues that you as a writer will glean that you've done your research properly. And those clues almost always come at various points in the creation of an article. I know that if I've done solid research, strong set of interviews, when I sit down to write a first draft, it's amazing how infrequently I actually then need to refer to my research materials. You just absorb it. If you have really immersed yourself in the research for a story, it's almost always there. And then it just kind of flows. The story just is there. You start to get a sense of a structure. You remember anecdotes. You think of a flow. You have a voice for the story. If you haven't done a great job with the research, a first draft is almost always torture. That to me is a sign when I haven't done enough research. If I sit down to write a first draft and I think, oh, where do I start? Oh man, then where do I go? Wait a minute, 2,500 words. How come I've only got 1,200 words? Like, what am I going to do? That's always a sign that I didn't do enough or the right kind of research. Another really great clue is in the fact checking. For those of you who work with magazines or outlets that do fact checking. When the fact checking goes well, that's a sign that you can say to yourself, okay, I did a pretty good job with the research. When it doesn't go well, then you've maybe got to think about how you did your research. Another sign that maybe I haven't done my research so well is when I sit down to write a first draft and I realize that I don't quite know yet what my through line is or what my central question is. These are elements that are related probably more to what I'm going to talk about in the next section, which is narrative journalism. But does everybody know what I mean by a through line? Spine of the story, where the story is actually going. And that doesn't mean A, B, C, D. It just means you have a sense of what the through line is. What is the central question? There's got to be a central question to every story. And then the story is the answer to that question. If you don't know those things and you're sitting down to write, you probably don't yet. You probably haven't done your research all that thoroughly yet. Okay, so then what are some of the tools that we use? Well, there are the obvious ones. We do background reading. I mean, before you go out to do any sort of story, I do this, you do a ton of reading. Don't overdo it, say a ton of reading, but there are pitfalls to knowing too much versus too little. Because one of the things that knowing too much does is it tends to make you feel like you already know the story. And almost invariably you don't. If you did know the story, why are you going to interview people, right? So you have to make sure that you don't overread. It also prevents you or forces you into the position of having to pretend later on, and I'll talk about this momentarily, to ask the dumb question, which is, what do you mean by that? I don't know what you mean by that. Can you explain that? Those are always better questions if you honestly don't know what the person is talking about. Libraries, and especially librarians. In this day and age, librarians are probably feeling more under siege than writers in a lot of ways because everybody is accessing everything online. Libraries are getting rid of books. Librarians are really struggling to figure out what they're about. They're reinventing themselves in some really interesting ways. But every single time I go to a library and I say to a librarian, I need help finding something, they're on it. And they say, what do you need? Let me find it. Because they love having something to do that's in research involved. So I really recommend using librarians. And not just at the local library. Go to the law library. Go to the medical library. Go to any library that has anything to do with your subject matter. And just talk to a librarian. They are awesome resources. Obviously, the internet, we all know about that. Use it, but don't rely on it. Obviously, Google is handy, but I always use it just really for basic background. Social media becoming more important. I'm not on social media, so, it's not a big thing for me. And then firsthand observation. Now, this is sometimes more often becoming a bit of a luxury in today's media landscape, getting sent somewhere to interview people and do firsthand research. But if you have the ability to do it, then get to where that person is. Even more importantly, find that person doing something. When you are interviewing somebody, it's great if you can just sit down and talk to them. That's awesome. You want their attention. But also observe them. Watch them in action. Watch them doing what they are known for doing. It's even better if it's some situation where they're under some kind of pressure. And the best case scenario of all is when you get to talk to somebody in or around or immediately in the middle of a moment when they're under a lot of pressure, because character is always revealed by pressure. And so anytime you can find yourself in that environment, take full advantage of it. It can be a little uncomfortable, and that's something you just have to get used to. And people don't always like it, but if you need friends, you shouldn't be a journalist. You know, make your friends outside of journalism. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'm here to see Bruce Grierson, who's one of my best friends. But we were friends before we even knew we wanted to be writers. And then also thinking time. This is something that people don't give themselves in our, you know, our lives and our professional ways now. We're just always on demand. We always have deadlines. We always need to be productive. But it's really important to give yourself some time to think. And this is, I don't just mean thinking, I mean letting it absorb. And what I really mean by that is letting your subconscious work, because we all need time to let our subconscious figure things out. It's really valuable. And sometimes it involves even just, you know, letting an interview settle, letting a piece settle, let a first draft settle for a couple of days before you look at it again. And then discussion with peers. Very, very important. You can't do your best work in isolation, at least I can't. Whether it's an editor, a colleague, a peer, a friend, a partner, try to find someone to bounce ideas off of. And just remember that these things are, editing is a dialogue. Editing is not a standoff. And there is not a single piece that I've ever written that wasn't made better by good editing, by an editor. So very important. So key point to me is create a research plan. Again, it depends on how complex the story is. But if you're dealing with a story that could be, you know, anything, well, really anything over probably 600 or 700 words long, up to, you know, stories, the piece I just alluded to, the Ignatieff piece, I think was about 7,000 words. So these things are going to require multiple sources, multiple interviews, multiple settings, multiple locations. It's really important to have some kind of research plan. You know, treat it as an informational skeleton, and then think about it as it goes along. Don't be afraid to alter it. But if you just have a big assignment and you just dive in without even thinking about where it's going or who to talk to or what to do or what a potential structure is going to be like, then I think you could be in a bit of trouble. Look very closely at the cartoon. Isn't that great? Escher, get your ass up here. So yes, good idea, but be flexible enough. You know, think about what you need to do in order to gather the material to write your story. Map it out. How many interviews? How much secondary material? How much preparation? How much advanced reading? How much do you actually need to know? I always like, when I'm working on a really complex story, I always like to map out the components of what I need and break them down. Who I need to talk to, what areas of the story I need to cover off with interviews or some other form of expert analysis, what background reading. I always think of locations. To quote every real estate agent who ever lived, location, location, location. Location is extremely important, not just for the scenes you're going to write in the story, but it's very important for the interviews that you're going to conduct, and I'll come back to that. So I like to map all that out, this research component, creating this plan. It's sort of like the way a film director scouts locations, and they block out scenes, and they do all that before they start shooting. So now that we have put the interview into the context of an overall research plan, we can now cut to the chase, the interview. Any questions? I guess the first thing I would do is reiterate that you should be flexible enough to alter your research plan depending on what you find out. So, you know, don't be too rigid about it. But what does a research plan look like? It depends who you are. I'm a very visual person, even though I'm a writer, or maybe that they're very closely related. But I write stuff and put sticky notes on the wall. I have a whiteboard. I create a huge whiteboard. I create flow charts. I create, what are those things called? Relational maps between people. I obviously list all the interviews. I make lists of thematic concerns, structural concerns. So I make lists of potential central questions. So it can be really dependent on who you are. Some people use Excel spreadsheets. One tool that a lot of people are using right now that I actually use for writing fiction, I don't use it as much for writing nonfiction, is Scrivener. I don't know if any of you use Scrivener. It's a writing app, and it's a great tool for organizing material. Really, really good. If this kind of, if organizing your materials is something that you occasionally struggle with, I would recommend something like Scrivener. Oh, that's an old one. This is for a novel that I've been working on, but this is a program where you can create all kinds of flow charts and all kinds of stuff. It's called MindNode. That's not the right one, but anyway. So that's a pretty cool thing. It depends on how you think. If you're more a written person, then you can write it out. If you're more kind of a businessy kind of person, you could use an Excel. If you're more artistic, you could use MindNode. If you like things to be just very orderly and yet visual, Scrivener is quite good. So it just depends who you are. I think probably the one that I use most is a combination of Scrivener and just putting crap up on the wall. I mean, I'm always putting, sticky notes and those 3x5 cards, and I put those up, and then I move them around, and then if I'm using 3x5 cards, I'll keep them in related groups, and then stick them up on the wall. So everything that is related to the interviews or who I need to interview, thematic concerns, I'll put them up there. So it's really just about finding what works for you and then being flexible about it.